Welcome into the Locked On Knicks podcast. Today we have a Locked On crossover with our friends over at Locked On Cavs. We were talking about if Cleveland's Big Four actually makes sense. What are some of the biggest questions surrounding the Knicks heading into next season and how the two teams match up with the Knicks could maybe take advantage of Cleveland? All that and more next on Locked On Knicks.
You are Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, what's up, guys? You are Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast. I want to remind you that today's episode is sponsored by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. And I want to remind you to make Locked On Knicks your first listen today and every day, because we are now available on all platforms. So be sure to subscribe on YouTube. Hit that notifications bell to ensure you never miss one. And then hit the auto download function on your favorite podcast platform of choice. It also really helps a lot if you like. Comment, leave a 5-star review on iTunes. If you leave a funny one, or if you leave any 5-star review, we will read it out on the pod, give you a shout out. That would be a lot of fun. But who's talking to you? I'm Gavin Schall. I've been covering the NBA for a decade, and just a little warning and something I'm bummed about. I moved cross country yesterday. I somehow forgot to bring the USB on my microphone, or if I didn't forget it, it is somewhere in my luggage that I haven't yet found. That being said, the audio on this one and the audio on Monday's episode is going to be a little bit below usual standards. I apologize for that, but I think it is still going to be a lot of fun. It's for the first time ever we get to catch up with the newest host of Locked On Cavs, Danny Cunningham. I won't delay the fun any longer. Let's get into it right now with Danny. Shoot this right over when we're done. All right. And then do you want to mention anything other than Locked On Cavs when I bring you in?
No, that's fine. Locked On Cavs is cool.
Okay, sweet. All right. 3, 2, 1. All right, guys, as promised, lucky enough to be joined by Danny Cunningham, the new host of Locked On Cavs. Danny, I didn't even get to ask you pre-show. Is this your first Locked On crossover? You've done one before, or is this new territory for you?
So I've jumped on a couple of other Locked On shows, and I've had a couple of other Locked On hosts on Locked On Cavs, but this is like the first official crossover one I've done. I've been on with Koo for Locked On Pistons right after they hired JB Bickerstaff, because of course I'm an expert in JB Bickerstaff, as everyone in Cleveland is. But this is like the first true Locked On crossover episode I've done. So this is quite an honor for, I'm sure, both of us.
I'm incredibly excited, especially because I think we've had more crossovers with Locked On Cavs than any other podcast over the years. The two teams have just seemed linked since that series. So I'm excited to continue a proud tradition here on Locked On Knicks. Where I wanted to start off, Danny, because I've just been confused by this, and it's a broad question. I'm sure it's one you've been talking about all summer, but as an outsider, I remain perplexed and interested. I think it's just one of the most fascinating stories in the NBA, and it's that does Cleveland's core four make sense together, that they, as you were telling me pre-show, kind of doubled down on this offseason, giving Evan Mobley an extension, obviously giving Donovan Mitchell an extension, obviously giving Jarrett Allen an extension, maybe a little surprisingly. And that in and of itself, none of that is shocking. Like, of course, you want to keep the asset, even if it doesn't work out. You want to be able to trade one or multiple of those guys. You want to be able to trade Darius Garland and still have Donovan Mitchell if it's not working out. But what do you think the future is of this group that always seems to play better when one of them is out or two of them are out?
So I think that we're going to find out what Kenny Atkinson can really do as a coach. And I do think I entered this offseason as someone who believed that the Cavs were not going to return all 4 guys from their core 4. I thought at least one, if not 2 of those guys would be traded away. And I thought the most likely candidates would be Darius Garland, because I was always of the belief Donovan Mitchell was going to re-sign and stick around in Cleveland. So I thought Garland was a candidate, and I thought Jarrett Allen was a candidate, just because Evan Mobley still has such a high ceiling, even if he hasn't reached it. But by everyone essentially signing a contract extension here, that group's going to stay together, as we know. I think we're going to find out what Kenny Atkinson can get out of that group this year. I think that Jarrett Allen's contract extension in particular says, okay, this is what the group is. It's solidified. Let's see what you can do as a coach. Let's see what you can change offensively in particular, because we can both agree the Cavs are in a pretty good space defensively. Not much needs to be tweaked on that end of the floor, but offense is what hampers them. So if Kenny Atkinson can manufacture space in a way that JB Bickerstaff couldn't with this group of guys on the Cavs, then they're going to look better and the future is going to be brighter. If he can't, I would still expect us to have a different conversation next year where one of those guys is traded away. And Jared Allen signed that extension. I was surprised he signed it just because I think ultimately if he would have waited to reach free agency, he probably would have gotten more money than he signed for with this extension. So I think that he is still very, very tradable. It's just that he's not eligible to be traded now until February 2nd. So I do think, depending on how this year goes, is going to shape the future. Signing the extensions almost kicked the can down the road a little bit, if that makes sense.
No, I think it does. And so often NBA teams are kind of happy to maintain homeostasis. And for Cleveland, I mean, very similar to in New York, like you don't scoff at 50 wins, right? Like that's not the end of the world with a team that is still, by and large, very young across the board. So I hear that. To me, the Knicks and the Cavs situations, maybe the Knicks are in a slightly better position right now, but it's very similar in that it comes down to your point, just their ability to space the floor on offense. I think the Knicks are in a better spot in that, like, they're 1 through 3 unquestionably are going to be able to shoot the ball. And they're 4 in Julius Randle's not a great shooter, but he is a very willing shooter. And in the NBA, that has a lot of power. And it could be argued is actually even more important than being an accurate shooter on low volume, which I think is the ongoing question with Evan Mobley. And that's where I've fallen this entire time. Like, if he can't shoot, you have to get Jared out of town. He's going to have to figure out how to play some center. If he can shoot, all of a sudden, like, Cleveland could be a genuine title contender. Where are you at in terms of like your confidence in Mobley eventually turning into a high volume 3-point guy? And what do you like specifically think Kenny Atkinson can do to work around that? If that is not in the cards, at least for this season, because Evan Mobley's still very young.
So I think it kind of depends on what you determine as high volume. Like, I don't think Evan Mobley's ever going to be someone that goes out there and shoots 8 3-pointers a game, which is high volume. Can he shoot 4 a game? I think that's much more realistic. The reason why I have faith that can happen is take a look at Kenny Atkinson's history. So we all know him basically as the guy who was in Brooklyn when things, or I guess right after things fell apart with how bad they were in the post Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce era. Kenny Atkinson was the guy that righted that ship. Well, one of the things he did there that helped to right that ship was he turned Brook Lopez from someone who was strictly just a back-to-the-basket player to someone who could shoot a lot of three-pointers. And he did become a high-volume three-point shooter. If you look at Kenny Atkinson's stop before Brooklyn, when he was an assistant on Mike Budenholzer's staff in Atlanta with the Hawks, well, Al Horford, before that staff was there, Al Horford did not shoot three-pointers. With Kenny Atkinson's aid, he became someone that turned into maybe not a super high volume, but a much more potent three-point shooter. Because of that history, I do think that Evan Mobley is going to step outside more, take more of those shots. And it's not for me, it's not the talent. Like, Evan Mobley has the talent to do it. I don't know if he's always comfortable doing it. I do think there were some good signs at the end of last year where Evan shot, and he had injury issues all year long, but when he was healthy at the second half of the year, he shot like 37% from 3. Now, it was on less than 2 a game, and that volume is just not going to cut it. But that's a sign to me that, okay, this can happen. If it doesn't happen, I actually think the key to more space is going to be Darius Garland, because him and Donovan Mitchell, it didn't work out last year. A lot of it was because Darius Garland's injuries were just brutal. He missed 6 weeks with a fractured jaw. He had a thumb or wrist thing going on earlier in the season that really wasn't talked about all that much. He had some off the court things too that I think were really slowing him down. But I think if he and Mitchell can get back to what they were in their first regular season together, and Darius Garland can actually become more of a volume 3-point shooter, someone that's taking more catch and shoot opportunities, that's still the main playmaker, but a little bit less so, a little bit more of a shooting threat from the outside. I think that is an alternate way to create space if Evan Mobley's not doing it for you.
Yeah, and I love Darius Garland as a player, and I think he has obviously not played up to this level yet, and like he should not be in the same sentence as this guy right now. But I've always seen some Steve Nash in his game, and like maybe more than anything else, and like even in terms of just how clean his shot is ridiculous and scary as someone who's been against him in a playoff series when he really gets going. And if he could be weaponized off ball, like especially like this is what we always talk about with the Knicks when Dante DiVincenzo's out there, not just spacing the floor out to the 3-point line, but spacing out like, hey, like you have to guard this guy 30 feet away from the basket. And what could the Cavs bigs with their passing ability? What could Donovan Mitchell do with that kind of space? I think it's exciting. My one final big question about Cleveland before we flip it around and talk Knicks a little bit. You said defense isn't really a question for you. And to me, that's interesting only in the sense that Isaac Okoro, unless I missed something, like still a question if he will be back. And I think like in an Eastern Conference, and this is something Tim Bontemps brought up in a really excellent article today on ESPN. You're looking at so many great wings. Obviously, the Bucks with Chris Middleton, Giannis would be guarded by a big. The Knicks now have Bridges, they have Anunoby, they have Hart, DiVincenzo could be guarded by Donovan Mitchell, but is sort of a wing. Boston, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, on and on and on and on. Like, what is Cleveland's answer to those matchups? And is it as simple like, all right, like beat Max Strus off the ball and then try to do your best against Jared Allen and Evan Mobley? Or like, how does Cleveland kind of solve for that? And is that something you're concerned about, or do you think that's not really much of an issue?
I mean, some of those guys I do think are just guys that really there's not an answer to the question, right? Mm-hmm. Like Jason Tatum, you can be a great defender and you still might not be able to stop him. And we, you and I talk about a league. Stop him. Right, exactly. But you and I talk about a league where good offense beats good defense every time. So I don't want to minimize the impact defense has, but there are nights where, and I will say, I expect Isaac Okoro to be on the Cavs this year. I think if he were going to be somewhere else, it would have happened already. I don't know if that it's going to be a long-term thing. He could be someone that plays out this year on the qualifying offer, as he still is just kind of floating around in restricted free agency. And he is the team's best perimeter defender. I will say I would like to see Evan Mobley out on the perimeter a little bit more as a defender, because I think he's really good at that. But the Cavs have been under JB Bickerstaff, and I'm interested to see how much this changes under Kenny Atkinson. But they've been so steadfast on defending the rim, and I understand why. It's a really important thing to defend. But I do think that we could maybe see Evan Mobley be a little bit more versatile defensively. I would love to, when they play Boston, I think their first game against the Celtics is the end of October, early November. I would love to see him defend Jason Tatum. Just like that, let that be your matchup for the night. Because I think he's capable. I think he's the best answer the Cavs have for a lot of those questions. And if you're going to have both him and Jarrett Allen on the floor together, you can have one of them defending the rim. Evan has sort of gone into this free safety role when that's been the case. But why not have him just defend the other team's best player too, instead of being in that free safety? That's something I'd like to see. I think that can kind of be an answer to some of the really good wings in the Eastern Conference. I also think if Isaac Okoro is back, he's another answer. Max Strus is a fine defender. The Cavs, outside of Darius Garland, Donovan Mitchell, and I think even those two, it's a little bit overblown what they are as defenders. I don't think they're as bad as people sometimes talk about. But they just really don't have a lot of poor defenders on the team. Like right now, Karis LeVert, I don't know if he's a candidate that could maybe get traded. I talked about that on an earlier episode of Locked On Cavs this week. But he's a good defender, and he's got decent size. Like they don't have a ton of defensive player of the year candidates. They've got Evan Mobley, but they don't also have a lot of minuses defensively too, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you look back at that Boston series, and it certainly in spurts, they held up surprisingly well, particularly without Jared Allen. And it's funny hearing you talk about Evan Mobley that way, because I think it's a similar conundrum the Knicks will have with OG Anunoby. And maybe getting Mikal Bridges will open up the ability to use him as a free safety a little bit more. But Danny, I want to hear your biggest questions on the Knicks. We'll talk about that next on Locked On Knicks and Locked On Cavs.
Today's episode brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships. It's also the same formula to keep your ride or die alive. These two teams we're talking about today, Cavs, Knicks, they're both searching for that formula to win a championship. You don't need to search any further for the formula to keep your ride or die car alive. That's because you've got eBay Motors, and they've got everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to that peak performance we're talking about. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more. Whether you're into speed, power, style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you will always find exactly what you're looking for. And, this is important, with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers.
All right, we talk Cavs. Let's talk Knicks. Danny, what are sort of your biggest looming questions about the Knicks as a contender in the East, and particularly as a threat to Cleveland this year?
So I really like what the Knicks did this offseason. Obviously, now the Knicks will play their home games not at Madison Square Garden anymore, but on Villanova's campus in Philadelphia, which I do wonder how the fans are going to react to that. But with all the guys from Nova that are on the Knicks, I feel as if that is the thing that does have to happen. But with what they've done this offseason, obviously they couldn't retain Isaiah Hartenstein because OKC threw a bag at him that the Knicks were not able to pay, not because they're cheap, just because the rules said, hey, you're not allowed to pay this guy that much money, which I think is a little bit...
Bad rule.
I agree. Like, I think it's silly that they've got this guy in Isaiah Hartenstein, who, of course, Cavs fans know because I think, and I know he played elsewhere before Cleveland, but I think he kind of got his start into becoming what he's become in Cleveland. But they can't pay him enough money. OKC can pay him more because they have cap space and the Knicks don't. How is New York going to replace that size? Because if you take a look back at the playoff series these two teams had a couple years ago, I thought not only Hartenstein, but Mitchell Robinson, who is still in New York, although he's had a lot of injuries over the last couple of years that you do have to think about. The Knicks went from a team that were big bullies to now they've got a lot of wings. I don't know how much depth they have in the front court. How do you anticipate that looking?
Yeah, so that has been my single biggest question over the offseason, and some people listening are probably tired of me talking about it because I feel like I bring it up almost every single episode. To me, it's like it's almost less so. I think we almost haven't focused enough on the element you're bringing up, and it's a fantastic point. What I've been fixated on is the spacing issues with Mitchell Robinson versus Isaiah Hartenstein. Essentially, everyone in the Knicks rotation shot like 3 to 6% better with Isaiah Hartenstein on the floor than with Mitchell Robinson on the floor because he was just with his kind of innate ability to be a playmaker at the top of the key, to participate in dribble handoffs, to set screens for shooters off the ball. He was someone who could operate away from the rim, draw a defender away from the rim, and still be a great offensive rebounder. Mitchell Robinson, the trade-off is he is not a great offensive rebounder. He is the best offensive rebounder along with Steven Adams in the NBA. The issue is he gives you none of that spacing. He is totally rim-bound, and that is kind of what I was getting at earlier when I said I think the Knicks actually have some similar concerns to the Cavs in that the Cavs have like two bigs who are like kind of stretchy. The Knicks have Julius Randle, who's like pretty close to being like a genuine stretch big. I think you'd have to call him that, even if he's not a great shooter. And then Mitchell Robinson, who is as opposite of a stretch big as you will ever get in 2023, unless you watch his offseason tapes of him just scrubbing high schoolers. Then he's bombing threes off the dribble, and maybe Tom Thibodeau's going to let him do that this year. Who knows? But I think you also bring up a really good point on this, and it is that the Knicks' identity as a team was defined by their physicality. Like 2 years ago, they had the third best offense in basketball while being a pretty mediocre shooting team. And the only reason that was possible is because they never turned the ball over and they rebounded the basketball like madmen. And then in the playoffs last year, they also really leaned into that identity with Julius Randle off the floor. They didn't have the offensive talent that the Sixers had. They maybe didn't even have the offensive talent that the Pacers had. And yet, without injury, they were on track to win both those series because they had some dogs, like D8WGS dogs. And they still do without Isaiah Hartenstein. Again, Mitch is fantastic on the glass. Josh Hart is the best 6'5" and under offensive rebounder in modern NBA history. Dante DiVincenzo is very good at crashing the glass. Julius Randle is opportunistic and physical on the boards. Mikal Bridges and OG Anunoby's case, super strong, super long. Mikal can fly in for boards. They have guys who can do that, who can bring that defensively. I think they will still have a lot of that. I would feel more secure about it if Isaiah Hartenstein was on the team, because to your point, they're one Mitchell Robinson injury away, which is not a risk. It feels like an inevitability at this point for being extremely thin and quite short at the center position. And I wonder how they're going to work around that. And sort of the big question for the Knicks was, all right, how do they make an all-in move while still maintaining their identity? I think giving up 5 first-round picks for Mikal Bridges was their version of threading that needle because they didn't really have to give up anyone. Hartenstein just happened to leave anyways, and that sucks. And I do think there are some real questions if they can fully maintain their identity. And I think even more importantly, if they can space the floor offensively and just have enough depth if something happens to Mitch. And I wonder if there's a move coming at center because of that. And I almost think there has to be for the Knicks to be genuine title contenders.
Yeah, I do think there has to be. And if for no other reason, because the team that both of the teams we cover are very clearly looking up to, the Boston Celtics, while Kristaps Porzingis really wasn't needed for them to win a championship this year, you still do have to think about the threat of him if he does come back from his leg injury and is healthy this year. You know, you need probably more than one big guy to defend that and to really compete with Boston at that level. I think the Knicks are built that way on the wing, but they're not necessarily built that way on the front court. I'm glad you mentioned Julius Randle because that's where I wanted to go next. I cannot think of too many other guys that are a year removed from being a member of an all-NBA team that have just become, to me at least, and I think on the national level, a bit of an afterthought because of the move for Bridges that the Knicks made, because of the ascension that Jalen Brunson has made. But where does Julius Randle fit into this team? Because 24 months ago, we were talking about the Knicks as his team, and now I just wonder, how does he even fit into this group?
So first of all, I want to say I think you're absolutely correct in your assessment, and I want to say secondly, I think it and I, to be clear, we've done the exact same thing on this podcast, and we have talked about him more so as a conundrum than as someone who's like, yeah, that's your rock, that's your star. And it's unfair to Julius in the sense that he was playing the best basketball of his life when he got hurt. Like the Knicks went on, what was it, 14-1 stretch or so after getting OG Anunoby. I cite this stat all the time, but in that month of January, they posted the best net rating any team had in the NBA for a full month last year, tied with two different months the Boston Celtics had at plus 15.8. Like he was a very willing ball mover. He was shooting the ball well against some of the best defense in the league. Like he dropped like 37 points on the Timberwolves. Like he was really, really cooking and on a trajectory to make his third All-NBA in 4 years. And at a certain point, if someone's a top 15 player, at least in the regular season, 3 of the last 4 years, you got to say like that's kind of who he is, at least in the regular season. But because of bad injury luck the last 2 years and a dismal performance 4 years ago now, that's crazy to say, he has no playoff resume whatsoever. And that is a really significant question. And we've had 2 off seasons in a row where we've sort of been ruining the fact that we just didn't get to see this guy just as an information gathering exercise. The Knicks are on this tight timeline where Jalen Brunson is still fairly young, still in his prime, but now is obviously go time with them getting Mikal Bridges. And if Julius Randle had been in full health the last 2 playoffs, you might say on one hand, all right, that is a guy that we are locked in with, and he is just a dude in the playoffs that you can trust, and he's going to put up 24, 10, and 5 assists on good enough efficiency. He's going to try just enough on defense to make it all worth it, and we are rocking and rolling with that guy. He can be your second best player on a championship team, and the Knicks just can't say that with a straight face because, Danny, we simply have not seen it, and that, I think, is for all the incredibly good things that have happened to the Knicks over the last 2 years. Easily the best stretch of basketball since I, at 29 years old, became a Knicks fan in like 2003. That is the one kind of poop in the punch bowl that I just can't avoid and I keep coming back to. And there are still real questions like, all right, if this doesn't look great and the fit isn't as clean as they wanted, and I have some questions about it all being seamless, like, is Julius Randle an in-season trade candidate, especially given the fact that he has not signed an extension yet? That is looming large coming into this season.
Right, and I do wonder what the relationship is like between him and the franchise, because they have, and I think correctly so, built around Jalen Brunson because of what we've seen from Brunson in the postseason, where Randall's been, an All-NBA guy in the regular season. Brunson hasn't quite, maybe gotten to that level consistently yet in the regular season. I certainly think that he will, but they're building around the right guy. But it does just beg the question to me, and you brought up the in-season trade as maybe a pathway that could go down. It's a really difficult thing to be the guy in a place, especially in a place like New York, and then all of a sudden not be the guy and still fit in there. So I do wonder if he could be somebody that's moved. If he is moved, what kind of package do you think it would be for?
I think the challenge is that he is not a perfect fit for the starting lineup. I think with Hartenstein, it would have worked really well. I think with Mitch, it's a challenge because Julius can take a bunch of threes. Like he's 2 years removed from nearly halfway through the season, I think, leading the NBA in made threes, which was just a revelation. He was not shooting them particularly well, but was just chucking them up and hitting like 34%. And that was fun. And that version of Julius can still work. I don't know if that's the best version of him. I thought the best version of him was him just being a bulldozer and just like bullying guys towards the rim and then showing off this feathery turnaround game, like 5 to 10 feet from the basket. And at times getting all the way to the rim and dunking it. That's kind of the Julius that I know and love. But I don't know if that guy is a perfect fit in the starting lineup to the point that I think their best lineup in terms of net rating and the lineup that might close some games will probably not feature Julius Randle. It might be Brunson, Anunoby, Bridges, DiVincenzo to give you that extra bit of shooting, and Mitchell Robinson, or it could be a small ball version of that with Julius playing some center. And I think whether or not that lineup works and whether or not Tom Thibodeau is willing to use that lineup is ultimately what's going to shape whether Julius makes sense on this team. Because even though he's not a perfect fit, they just kind of need his shot creation at the end of the day, right? And that's why he still belongs here. And if they don't have him, and I know this is I'm not directly answering your question, but this is why, is like you just cannot afford to lose that shot creation unless you're bringing back similar shot creation and someone who's a better fit. To answer the question, I have no idea who that guy is. On the surface, it would be someone who could shoot threes and protect the rim. Unfortunately, Boston is not trading Kristaps Porzingis for Julius Randle. I don't think. I don't think Indiana would trade Miles Turner for Julius Randle. And the list of those guys, I know San Antonio is not trading Victor Wembanyama for Julius Randle. The list of those guys really, really, really short. But that is the type of player they would need. A big guy who could shoot the three, protect the rim, and create a little bit. And I think it's where I ultimately come down to that they're not going to trade him because I don't think they can go and get that guy this year. I think it's more likely they trade Mitchell Robinson and some of the remaining assets for a big who can kind of do a facsimile of some of those things. And the guy who I've kept coming back to this offseason, maybe this is something we can pick up on next segment, is Jarrett Allen. And I have some curiosity if Cleveland would be willing to move on from Allen if they picked up some assets, if they got someone in Mitchell Robinson who certainly does not provide the versatility that Allen does, not the skill level that Allen does, is maybe only a slightly better defender. It'd be fair to argue that Allen's the better defender because he's more flexible, even if he's not the rim protector that Mitch is at times. And I don't even know if that's true. Allen had fantastic at the rim numbers last year. But with Mitch, I think it would allow you to move Mobley to center. It would allow you to bring Mitch off the bench, and you might be able to pick up like a couple first-round picks and some extra assets. So I'm curious if that's something Cleveland would potentially be interested in. Let's talk about that next. Let's talk about how the two teams would match up in a potential playoff series to wrap up this edition of Locked On Cavs and Locked On Knicks. But first, we want to tell you about our good friends over at BetterHelp and remind you that this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or therapy day. When your schedule is packed with kids' activities, big work projects, and more, it's easy to let your priorities slip. For me, that is going to the gym, even though it doesn't look like it. It is sort of either that or playing some pickup basketball. I know when I'm anxious, when I'm stressed, it is one thing that will always give me relief. It's kind of hard to get myself to go. The other thing is therapy. It's an absolute non-negotiable for me. It is kind of the one space I have where I can just go and vent, get everything out, and also get some context for what I'm feeling and maybe put it in perspective and find ways to say, hey, you're feeling this, but ultimately you can push through, you can make friends with those feelings, and you can feel better. So if you're thinking about starting therapy, get BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. All right, so Danny, I just made a very compelling case about why Cleveland maybe shouldn't trade Jarrett Allen, but I'm wondering if there's any opening there because he's like, when I was going through bigs in the NBA that could realistically be on the block, like, do you think there's any desire in Cleveland to say like, hey, how does this look if Evan Mobley's playing center? And maybe we could, and I guess this would be the more likely version of Allen trade. Maybe we could get a stretch four in there that can also play some defense.
Right. I think the Cavs, if that does happen, if Evan Mobley looks awesome in the minutes that he's playing center this year, because those minutes will still exist, then I think it is something to consider. It should be a stretch four, maybe even a three, because the Cavs right now just have no depth on their wing. Like they've got two guys that I think are awesome guards. They've got two awesome bigs, and then they kind of have a bunch of in-between guys on the wing where they have a ton of players that are like 6'5" and below. When you talk about Max Strus, Karis LeVert's around that size. Isaac Okoro is around that size. Jalen Tyson's a little bit bigger. And then they've got Dean Wade, who's like their only normal sized wing where he's 6'8", 6'9", but he gets hurt all the time. And he is one of the most irreplaceable players they have, not because of how good he is, but because they just don't have a replacement for him. So I do think if Jarrett Allen is somebody that the Cavs would look to move on from at a certain point, that's the type of player they should be targeting. Someone that can play the 4 and the 3, and you move Evan Mobley to center full time, because ultimately I think that is sort of how Evan reaches his ceiling. Is I think he does have to be a full-time center in the NBA. Now, all that said, with Jarrett Allen's extension that he signed this summer, that deal was signed, I believe, on August 2nd, which means he is not eligible to be traded for 6 months, which 6 months from that date would be February 2nd. And of course, the trade deadline is February 6th. So the Cavs really have a full season where they don't have to think about this, or a full 6 months where they don't have to think about this. And then if it's not working out, they've got 4 days to figure something out if that's the direction they want to go. I will be very curious if that's what they want to do. I would also be very surprised if they traded Jarrett Allen for another big. I think that would be something that'd be fairly stunning to me, because if that move is made, I think it's so Evan plays more center, not less.
That's totally fair, and it's why the Knicks are in a very tough position in terms of upgrading that spot. You always hear centers, you don't have to draft them early. There's a million of them, and then you really need one, and you're like, all right, kind of tough to go and find.
Right.
All right, let's wrap up on this. Regular season matchups, I think always fun, always very competitive between these two teams. One of the Knicks' wins of the year last season was when it appeared Jalen Brunson had like blown his knee out or a lower leg out, and the Knicks still were able to fight back and win. Cleveland over the last few years, like they've been like stretches with Donovan Mitchell where they've kicked the Knicks' butt. I always enjoy those games. I always look forward to those games. I would welcome another playoff matchup with the Cavs. I think that would be really interesting. How do you feel like the two teams match up? What are some of the things you're looking for the first time those two teams meet?
So I think that the Knicks are the better team right now. I love what the Knicks did in getting Bridges this offseason. I think that they have so much depth on the wing. They're a bad matchup for the Cavs. That said, the thing that I look at that is in Cleveland's favor that maybe wasn't in Cleveland's favor when these two teams played last year, played in the playoffs a couple years ago, is if Evan Mobley takes the leap forward that the Cavs and Cavs fans are expecting him to take, well, then it is something that they would have the advantage in the front court. They have the better two big men in him and Jarrett Allen, because Evan Mobley should be blossoming into an all-star player. We know Jarrett Allen is a fringe all-star player. He's made the all-star team once. I don't think that we should expect him to be like a regular appearance on that team, but I do think that's where the Cavs have the advantage. I will say, too, the one thing I love about how the schedule shakes out is these two teams play fairly early on. Like, I think it's that last week of October, first week of November type. And then they don't play again until, I think, after the All-Star break. So it'll be cool to get a taste of this, I guess, rivalry, if you want to call it that, early in the season, and then see what these two teams turn into before some pretty important end-of-season matchups, because they play right after the All-Star break, and then I believe they play twice the final week of the season. Those games could mean something.
I think it'll be a great litmus test for where the Cavs bigs are at and how they've changed and improved over the last 2 years. Because I'd push back on that point only in the sense that when we got that 5-game sample in 2022, I think the Knicks bigs got the better of that matchup. Mitchell Robinson, I think it could be argued maybe outside of Jalen Brunson's importance just as a scorer, like he might have been the best player in that series. Like he dominated the real estate around the rim. Jarrett Allen had the very famous "lights were too bright" quote. So I want to see if they've dimmed down for Jarrett Allen a little bit. I think Mitch physically was a little much for him. Maybe he's put on some bulk. And same with Evan Mobley, because the one shining moment for Julius Randle in the playoffs, and it's such a small thing to hold on to for a guy who's made 3 All-NBA teams, was in the first half of that Game 5. He had turned his ankle late in the regular season. It was the first time he looked healthy. And of course, like I think either right before halftime, right after halftime, he returned the ankle, and it was just a disaster. He needed surgery in the offseason, but he was kind of taking it to Evan Mobley. And Mobley's obviously, he's longer. He's a infinitely better defender than Julius Randle is. And yet Julius's physicality was a real problem for him. And I want to see if Mobley, I think this is where you start putting Mobley in that classroom, like, all right, maybe top 10 defender in the league. And some people rightfully in some years would have him top 5, top 3. To just being right there with Wemby is like, all right, and Chet is like, this is the dude. This is the ultimate freak you want in the NBA. If he like puts on just a little bit more strength, and to your point, like that could translate to guarding someone like Jason Tatum, which I didn't mention initially, but I think is a great one, and I would be really excited to see Cleveland lean into that a little bit more. So I'm Jason Tatum, and I see Evan Mobley lining up next to me. I'm not excited about my night. I'm not licking my chops saying this is going to be hell on earth. I'm going to have to grind to get to my usual 30 points a game. And I want to see if he could do the same to Julius Randle. And I want to see if the Knicks on the wing can put some stress on Cleveland. I think that's an opportunity for Mikal Bridges to really cook and have one of those nights. And this is something we've talked about. Like, he doesn't have to be who he was on the Nets. He just, like, a couple times a month, if he can put up an efficient 28 points, I think that's the difference between the Knicks being like a low 50s win team and like potentially pushing close to 60 wins this year. And I think Cleveland's the type of team he could go out. And of course, Jalen Brunson, Donovan Mitchell, it's the path not taken for the Knicks. Now it's the path really not taken with him extending in Cleveland. I just think that's always a really fun matchup between two of the best guards on earth.
Yeah, I could not agree more. Seeing those two, and Brunson's gotten obviously the better of Mitchell pretty consistently throughout their careers, but seeing those two go head to head, I think is a treat for not just Cavs and Knicks fans, but really for basketball fans. Like, I think it's great basketball to watch. I'm a big fan of Jalen Brunson's game. Obviously, I'm a big fan of Donovan Mitchell's game too. So anytime those two are competing against each other, I think it's a real treat.
All right, for Knicks fans, you can find Locked On Cavs wherever you can find podcasts. And, of course, go throw Danny a follow on Twitter at @RealDCunningham if you want to keep up with Cleveland. I think it's a good idea because I think the Knicks and the Cavs are going to be close in the standings all year. Cleveland, for the last 2 years, one of the best regular season teams in basketball. I think those games are going to be fun. I think the chase for the 1 seed or the 2 seed or the 3 seed is going to be really, really fun. And, of course, for Cavs fans listening, you can do the same with Locked On Knicks. Until next time, we will see you soon on Locked On Knicks and Locked On Cavs.